A dessert ruined before its time hides more than sweetness. Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host, Ombra. Drop a comment with your location. I treasure seeing this community grow. Your words make this journey special. Now, the story. If you want to disturb the sanctity of Nero Wolfe's brownstone, there are a few reliable methods. One is to bring a dead body into it, which I have always advised against for practical reasons. It makes Inspector Kramer lose hair faster. Another is to suggest Wolfe take a cab across town, which has about the same effect as asking a cat to do cartwheels. And then there's the third method. Come in talking about food. That morning started with the third. Fritz Brenner, our household's culinary Mozart, had just finished presenting me with a breakfast that put the average New York diner to shame. Soft scrambled eggs with chives, sausages, and toast that crunched the way toast ought to. Wolfe was still upstairs with his orchids, and I was enjoying coffee and peace when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find a woman in her mid-30s, done up with enough elegance to pass muster at the Pierre, but with a look in her eye that told me she wasn't there to talk recipes. She carried a slim white box tied with ribbon, the kind you'd expect from a high-end patisserie. "My name is Mrs. Louise Vardell," she said, voice crisp as if rehearsed. "I must see Mr. Wolfe immediately. It concerns a matter of—" she glanced down at the box. "Well, of justice and chocolate." That got my attention. Chocolate is one of Wolfe's few approved indulgences outside beer, beef, and Fritz's genius. I told her the odds of seeing Wolfe before he finished communing with his orchids were lower than a snowball's chance in July. But she insisted, and her insistence was wrapped in the kind of desperation you don't usually hear before noon. So I did what any good legman does. I ushered her in and parked her in the office, with strict instructions not to touch anything. When Wolfe finally came down, orchid dust brushed from his sleeves. I gave him the briefing. "Client, female, name Louise Vardell. She's packing chocolate." That last word did the trick. Wolfe's eyes narrowed on the box like a general eyeing enemy artillery. He lowered himself into his throne behind the desk, flicked a finger at me to bring her in, and muttered, "Pfui." At this hour, Mrs. Vardell wasted no time. She placed the box on Wolfe's desk, untied the ribbon, and revealed 4 delicate cups of chocolate mousse. But instead of pleasure, there was alarm. "This," she said, pointing, "should not have melted. It was prepared in my restaurant's kitchen, perfect temperature, proper chilling. Yet when served last night before a room full of guests, it collapsed. Not just one portion, every single dish. Sabotage." I glanced at Wolfe. Usually when people brought him complaints not involving bodies, money, or betrayal, he dismissed them with one syllable. But Wolfe's eyes had narrowed to slits, and I could tell he was already calculating. "Why?" Wolfe asked slowly. "Did you bring this here?" Mrs. Vardell's voice dropped. "Because I know it was deliberate. Someone wants to ruin me, and I believe the person will not stop at Mousse." I could see the crease form between Wolfe's eyebrows, the one that meant he was annoyed but intrigued. He leaned back, steepled his fingers, and asked the question that meant the hook had landed. "Who?" I didn't like the way she said it. People say who in 2 ways, like they're ready to name names, or like they're asking you to bless a guess. Mrs. Louise Vardell's who had the weight of a list behind it, and that list had kept her awake. She drew a breath as if to steady a tray and kept her eyes on Wolfe, which meant she had decided where the power in the room lived. I can respect that in a person, even if it's only the second time we've met. "My pastry chef, Adrien Lassalle," she said, and the name came out like she was admitting an expensive mistake. "He is brilliant and vain. He has threatened to leave twice, once to pursue celebrity, a television contract. I declined to rebrand my restaurant around his name." Wolfe's lids floated lower. If he was a cat, that was when the tail would start to move. Mousse, my general manager, Evan Greaves, she went on. He's practical, unimaginative, and angry that I refused an investor's demand to expand before we're ready. The investor is third, Mara Kincaid, a publicist with money. She put in capital and wants a kind of theater, theme nights. She brought a critic last evening. When the Mousse failed, the critic laughed. I kept my face professional, which means I only raised one eyebrow and not both. You don't often get the full trifecta, chef, manager, investor, lined up in a row. It's the restaurant equivalent of drawing to an inside straight and getting slapped by the dealer. And last, she said, softer, my ex-husband, Simon Dacre. He believes I owe him for the early years. He came by the kitchen yesterday claiming he was dropping off flowers for the private dining room. He knows our recipes. He resents that I don't use his palate anymore. Pfui, Wolfe said, and made it sound almost affectionate. He looked at the white box. Those are from the batch that failed? Yes. She lifted one cup. The mousse had a dull sheen that did not quite catch the light. It didn't hold a peak. She tilted the spoon and it slurred where it should have trembled. They were in the walk-in overnight covered. I brought 4 for you to see. I'm not looking for sympathy, Mr. Wolfe. I'm looking for proof. You invite me to prove sabotage as if it were a parlor game, he said, not moving, not blinking. If there was sabotage, you will then want me to identify a culprit, and to do so in a manner that does not subject your establishment to public ridicule. And you want it done swiftly, before Mara Kincaid or any of the other feathered bipeds make a press spectacle. You have chosen an inconvenient hour. I brought you chocolate, she said, and she managed a ghost of a smile that didn't travel far. I read enough to know that can be persuasive. It wasn't a bad move. With Wolfe, a good Stilton might purchase you an hour of consideration. Chocolate, properly made, could tilt the axis of the earth. He extended a hand without looking at me. The gesture was for the bell cord, but he had trained me well enough. I headed to the kitchen for Fritz. Fritz came in 3 minutes later, crisp as a new bill and as pleased as a boy with a pocket knife. He took one look at the mousse, another at Wolfe's face, and did not smile again. Yes, sir? 2 spoons, Wolfe said, and a plate of ice. Fritz left and returned in less than a minute. He placed the tray on the side table as if we were discussing treaties and not dessert. Wolfe shifted half an inch in his chair, which is his version of standing. Mrs. Vardell, to what degree is gelatin employed in this preparation? She nodded, prepared. A small bloom for stability. It's a banquet formula, 60 covers at once. Adrian insisted on a lighter set, egg whites and cream, but we compromise for durability when we must serve a room. It's not rubber, Mr. Wolfe. Or it wasn't. Who is permitted to handle the gelatin? Wolfe asked. He had not yet deigned to look at the mousse square on. He watched Louise as if he could weigh her by sight. Only pastry, she said. Adrian, the Sioux, and the apprentice, and me, if I'm there. Last night I was on the pass. The cream? Dairy. Pasteurized. Delivered at 3. Sealed. We checked the lot. The bowls? Stainless steel. Washed, dried, polished before service. I don't allow the pastry station anywhere near the garde-manger. Good. He at last turned to the cups, chose one and, with the care of a bishop selecting a wafer, took up a spoon. The move wasn't theatre. With Wolfe, food is closer to faith than recreation. He pressed the spoon to the surface and lifted. The mousse clung reluctantly and then let go with a sluggish sigh. He placed the spoonful on the plate of ice and watched it. I watched him. Fritz watched the spoon. Louise watched all of us. You could say we are not a conventional church. It took less than 30 seconds. The mound lost shape. It oozed a little. Wolfe sniffed the spoon, not the mousse, the way a man might smell the handle of a tool to see if the last worker had worn cologne. Then he tasted, Only once, and his face did something complicated that an untrained observer would have missed. "Archie," he said. "The bottle in the rear of the top left drawer, the one with the droppers." I fetched it. Fritz had put that little circus together for him years ago. 6 brown glass bottles with corks and labels, like a botanist who had lost his way and ended up in a kitchen. Wolfe held up a dropper, then didn't use it. He pressed his tongue to his lip, grimaced, and set the apparatus aside. "You said sabotage with confidence," he told Louise. "Why?" "Because the failure was uniform," she said. "Every dish. The texture broke at once when it reached room temperature. We serve that course after a 10-minute rest. At 6 minutes, they trembled. At 8, they wept. At 10, the critic put down his spoon and asked if this was intentional." "Critics," I said, "because sometimes the dice need a nudge." She ignored me. "Also, because the gelatin sheets were where they belong. The scale calibration was correct. The cream was fresh. And because Adrian can make a mousse blindfolded. If this had been incompetence, it would have been partial. Not an execution." Wolfe's fingers formed their little tent. "Humph. The enzyme families that digest protein don't care about your pride. Bromelain, papain, actinidin, pineapple, papaya, kiwi. A trace will break a set made with gelatin. If some bright soul introduced even a smear of such a juice to a bowl, to a spatula, to a whisk, your stability would be an illusion. Chill would disguise it. Time would betray it. Did your menu include any such fruit last night?" "Number, we ran an early autumn menu. Apples, figs, nothing tropical." "Good. You must put your kitchen in order by putting your people in order. That requires leverage." He looked at me. "Archie, telephone Mr. LaSalle and ask him to present himself here at 4. Mr. Greaves at 4:30, Ms. Kincaid at 5. As for Mr. Dacre, at 5:30. Each is to come alone. Mrs. Vardell will be present. If you think it's easy to tell strangers to appear in our office on a Friday as if it were a summons from Olympus, you have not spent enough time in New York. But people show up. The trick is the voice you use and the fact that when you say Nero Wolfe, doors open and knees loosen." Louise flinched. "Here?" "Here," Wolfe said. "You brought this to my door. You will not expect me to go to yours." "Fritz!" "Sir, remove those cups to the refrigerator. Not the kitchen, the office cabinet. We will test one again at intervals. Archie will time and record." Fritz did not love the idea of desserts living near the beer, but he took the box like a man receiving a flag. I started on the calls. Adrian LaSalle answered on the second ring with a voice like he had a mirror in front of him and liked what he saw. I introduced myself and Nero Wolfe, and he said, "The Mr. Nero Wolfe," the way a chorus girl might say, "the Gershwins." I told him the time and address. He said he had a prep meeting. I said he had a problem that threatened his career. He reconsidered. Evan Greaves made me repeat the address twice and asked, "Should I bring paperwork?" I told him to bring his wits if he could find them. He said that was very funny, and I said I thought so too. Mara Kincaid's assistant tried to screen, but potential criminal liability cuts through static. On the 4th, I got Simon Dacre, who managed to sound both hurt and bored, which is a trick. He suggested we make it another day. I suggested he say that to Wolfe himself. He agreed to 5:30 with a sigh I could have weighed on a scale. While I turned my attention to the clock and the ice plate, 10 minutes. Another spoonful had lost composure. Louise took in the room. I could see her seeing the shelves, the globe, the red leather chairs that are never for clients, the beer on the side table with its coaster, the desk that holds more than paper, and the way the air in that office belongs to Wolfe when he breathes it. She unclasped her hands. Some people bring their panic in with them and set it gently down. She kept hers close. "You believe it's one of them," she said, not as a question. "I believe that some motive intersected with opportunity. Wolfe said. The motive may be petty. Vanity, resentment, leverage. The opportunity was the kitchen. If this was done for sport, your concern that it will not end with Mousse is warranted. He closed his eyes briefly. That was as close as he ever gets to a wince. Food is a social contract. Treachery at the table is an old sacrilege. It offends me. It offended Fritz too, though he would put it in other words. He re-entered to exchange the plate for a fresh one and to drop a glance at Louise that wasn't pity but kinship. Professionals whose work had been toyed with. I didn't say it out loud, but one of the reasons Wolfe took this without the usual bristling was because her injury had been delivered with a spoon. Your fee, she began, and then stopped because Wolfe lifted a hand. It will be commensurate, and you will not find it extortionate, he said. You will also deliver 3 kilograms. He looked at Fritz. No, 5. Of the Santo Domingo 70% coverture you use, and 2 bottles of the rum you considered and rejected for the menu because you feared it would bully the chocolate. Louise blinked. How? Your pastry chef posts on the infernal internet, Wolfe said, and made it sound like a diagnosis. He boasts of your purveyors. I read him while my orchids soaked this morning. Spare me the twaddle in future. You read? She shut her mouth and smiled a little, and it reached her eyes this time. I like a client who can take a curveball without swallowing her tongue. We let the office do what it does for the next hour. It isn't magic, but it's as good. The books on the shelves stand straight and give backbone to conversations. The green of the plants keeps people from thinking they've come to court. The rug says we can afford patience. The phone calls went out and the appointments came in. I set up a sheet on my clipboard, timestamps, texture notes, and a column for any scent I could name. At 18 minutes, the second spoonful slid on the ice like a tired seal. At 25, a faint sweet-sour came up that didn't belong to chocolate, cream, or eggs. At 32, the structure quit completely. Wolfe grunted once and closed his eyes. He was working. Only a fool would interrupt. At 10 to 4, the sanctity of the brownstone took the first hit. The doorbell announced a man who had discovered lapels 3 months ago and wasn't finished admiring them. Adrien Lassalle in a jacket too tight to stir pata bombe in. His hair was the kind that requires a travel budget. I introduced him to the fact of our house rules before he got a foot over the threshold. No smoking, no video, and don't attempt the kitchen unless you want to die with your hand on Fritz's carving fork. Adrien walked into the office like a stage and measured the distance to the desk as if the applause cue were hiding under the blotter. He stopped 3 feet short of the red zone and put his fingers together as if they were auditioning for thought. Mr. Wolfe, Mr. Lassalle. Wolfe did not offer him a chair. Take one, not that one. Adrien took the third best chair and made it look like the first. His eyes flicked to the small refrigerator we keep behind the cabinet door and then back to Wolfe. He was trying to guess where we kept the evidence. He glanced at Louise and arranged his face into concern. It was so careful you could see the pencil lines. I am devastated. Later, Wolfe said. We will proceed in order. For now, you will listen. He flicked his eyes at me. Archie. I gave him the times and the notes. I didn't say bromelain, papain, or actinidine in case Adrien wanted to play innocent with vocabulary, but I didn't need to. Wolfe could put a man's soul on a scale by watching the corners of his mouth when he heard pineapple. Adrien didn't flinch, which can mean he's innocent or rehearsed. Louise sat with her hands folded as if they were guests. Wolfe asked Adrien about workflow. The bowls, the spatulas, the bath, the whip. Adrien said he washed, dried, polished. He smiled when he said polished. He said the apprentice, a boy called Leo, scaled the gelatin. He said he himself folded in the whipped cream and that he alone finished the cups. He said the manager had been tiptoeing through pastry to speed up plating for the investor's guest. He said the ex-husband had no business being in the corridor at all. He said many things, each with the weight of a finger pointing somewhere else. "Thank you," Wolfe said when he was done being entertained. "Remain. Mr. Greaves will join us presently. Do not attempt to explain yourself again until I request it. Explanations have an odor." The bell rang again. I went to answer it. The brownstone doesn't often host more than one stranger at a time. 2 in a row makes the floorboards shift under your good sense. Evan Greaves stood on the stoop with a folder and a face that had been assembled from caution and warranty disclaimers. Behind him, at the curb, a black car idled with tinted windows, as if money didn't want to come in but wanted to be able to say it was nearby. I looked at it, looked at him, and smiled as if the world were civilized. He smiled back like it might be. "Let's not keep the chef waiting," I said, and brought our second guest inside. The brownstone had been disturbed. The air knew it. So did Wolfe. He opened one eye as I ushered Greaves in and let it close again, content the way a man is content when he hears the key turn and knows the door's locked on the right side. Evan Greaves looked like the sort of man who ironed his collars twice and checked the locks 3 times before bed. He carried his folder as if it were a shield and stepped into Wolfe's office like he expected crossfire. His eyes darted around, cataloguing the leather chairs, the high bookshelves, the windows heavy with drapes that didn't let a person know whether it was rain or sun outside. When his gaze landed on Adrien Lassalle, sitting sleek and smug with his jacket tailored tighter than the truth, Greaves' lips compressed until they nearly disappeared. That told me plenty before he opened his mouth. "Mr. Wolfe," Greaves said, putting a little starch in his voice to prove he wasn't intimidated. "I don't quite understand the nature of this meeting. Mrs. Vardell didn't mention we'd be attending together." "That is because Mrs. Vardell is not the convener," Wolfe replied, eyes closed, hands folded in his familiar steeple. "I am. Sit." Greaves obeyed, choosing the chair farthest from Adrian, as though physical distance might translate to moral distance. He placed his folder neatly on his lap and kept one hand on it like he feared it might leap away. Louise, in her seat against the wall, remained composed but alert, eyes flicking between the men as though trying to measure which might burn her house down first. Wolfe let the silence stretch. He has a talent for that, filling the air with nothing until a man grows itchy enough to speak just to cover it. It didn't take long. "I run a restaurant," Greaves began, his tone defensive. "Restaurants run on margins, not magic. Equipment must be maintained, inventory rotated, staff disciplined. And yet, when something goes wrong, it is always the manager who is accused of negligence." Adrian chuckled, low and rehearsed, like a man waiting for his cue. "Negligence would be charitable in your case, Evan." "Gentlemen," Wolfe said, and the word froze the room. He didn't need volume, just precision. "I am not your referee. I am your adjudicator. I require facts, not quarrels. Mr. Greaves, confine yourself." Greaves bristled but nodded. "The Mousse fiasco wasn't negligence on my part. The kitchen is under Adrian's command. He and his staff have exclusive control. If there was tampering, it happened on his watch." Adrian leaned back, eyes gleaming. "Of course. Blame the artist. I create. Evan counts beans. He wouldn't know the difference between a sabion and a saboteur." I glanced at Wolfe. His lips twitched almost imperceptibly, which meant Adrian had just earned himself a black mark in the maestro's ledger. Wolfe doesn't like grandstanders, unless the grandstanding is his own. "Tell me, Mr. Greaves," Wolfe said, "who had access to the pastry station yesterday between 2 o'clock and service?" Greaves adjusted his cuffs, pleased to be given authority. "Officially, Adrian, his sous, and the apprentice. Unofficially, anyone with the nerve." Simone Dacre was loitering in the kitchen under the pretext of flowers. Mara Kincaid swept through twice with her critic in tow, against my express instructions. And frankly, Louise, your laissez-faire policy with investors is what allowed that. That was a neat little stab dressed up as procedure. Louise's jaw tightened, but she didn't rise to it. Wolfe opened his eyes and skewered Greaves with a look. "You will address me, not your employer, and you will not attempt to use this occasion to litigate internal grievances." Was there opportunity for an outsider to approach the pastry mise en place? Yes, Greaves admitted. Too many opportunities. We were understaffed in the dining room and stretched thin. I couldn't watch every corridor. Adrian smirked, but Wolfe cut him off with a flick of a finger. "Mr. LaSalle, when did you last inspect the gelatin sheets?" Adrian raised his chin. 3 in the afternoon. They were scaled precisely. If Evan is suggesting adulteration, then he should consider his own incompetence. He let Dacre drift in like smoke. "And yet," Wolfe murmured, "it was you who folded the cream. You who plated. You who presented. Yes?" Adrian hesitated a fraction too long. "Yes." Wolfe closed his eyes again, satisfied. "We will wait for Miss Kincaid. Until then, Mr. Greaves, you will surrender that folder to Mr. Goodwin for inspection." Greaves stiffened. "Those are financial records. Proprietary. They are mine," Wolfe said softly. "By the terms of your employer's request, everything germane to this dispute is mine until I am satisfied." "Archie," I extended a hand. Greaves hesitated, then surrendered the folder like it was a limb. I flipped it open and skimmed the neat rows of numbers, delivery slips, balance sheets. Typical manager's safety blanket. Nothing jumped out yet, but I've learned not to underestimate the power of paper when Wolfe asks for it. The bell rang again. This time, when I opened the door, the smell of expensive perfume got there first. Mara Kincaid entered like she owned the air, followed by a ripple of cold street breeze that made me glad when the door shut behind her. She wore black silk, had hair the color of a well-polished penny, and carried herself with the assurance of someone who signs checks and expects results. The black car outside made sense now. It wasn't just money. It was theater on wheels. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked into the office, offered Wolfe a smile that belonged in a press packet, and took the empty chair with her handbag poised like a scepter. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, voice smooth as syrup. "I've heard of you. Louise is lucky to have your attention. This is a matter of reputation, and I am, of course, deeply invested." "Indeed," Wolfe said, his tone like iron wrapped in velvet. "Sit. You are invested in more than reputation. Your critic guest last night. Who was he?" "Denton Cray," she said promptly. "Food section, City Herald. He's influential. He despises Adrian's flair but loves drama. I thought a little Mousse spectacle might persuade him." "Spectacle you got," I muttered. Mara's eyes flicked to me, quick as a cat's, then back to Wolfe. "I didn't mean for disaster. I wanted a show of innovation. I support Adrian's talent, though sometimes it veers into arrogance. If someone sabotaged him, it undermines not only his art, but my investment." Wolfe studied her with half-shut eyes. "You escorted Cray through the kitchen twice. Did you or he approach the pastry station?" She laughed lightly. "Of course not. I'm not a fool. Kitchens are dangerous. Knives, flames, tempers. I let Adrian preen for the critic, nothing more." Adrian inclined his head like an emperor, accepting tribute. Greaves looked ready to swallow a lemon whole. Louise kept her silence, though her fingers twitched slightly in her lap. "Mrs. Vardell," Wolfe said at last, turning his gaze, "did you consent to Miss Kincaid parading her guest through?" Louise's voice was quiet, but firm. She did it against my wishes." The temperature in the room dropped a degree. Mara's smile didn't falter, but her eyes sharpened. "I'm protecting our brand. You run the kitchen, Louise. I manage the narrative." Wolfe grunted. "You mistake narrative for fact. Archie, mark that." I scribbled a note. We weren't done. At 5:30 sharp, the bell rang again and Simon Dacre arrived. If Mara had brought theatre, Simon brought bitterness. He was tall, thinning hair brushed back like he resented it for leaving, and wore a suit that tried for elegance but missed the tailor's care. He greeted Louise with a smile that was all gall and no sugar, then looked at Wolfe as if measuring the man against his legend. "I don't know why I'm here," Simon said, lowering himself into a chair with deliberate insolence. "Louise's troubles are her own. We divorced years ago. Yet you were in the kitchen yesterday," Wolfe said evenly. "With flowers." Simon shrugged. "I wanted to be gracious, to show no hard feelings. She never did appreciate gestures." "That corridor does not lead to a dining room," Wolfe said. "It leads to mise en place." "Maybe I got lost," Simon said, voice dry. Greaves made a sound, half laugh, half curse, but Wolfe quelled it with a glance. "You have knowledge of her recipes. Did you handle any utensils? Any bowls?" Simon leaned back. "Number, when if you're suggesting I poisoned a pudding to get back at her, that's absurd. I wouldn't waste the effort." Louise's face was white, but she didn't speak. Wolfe shifted slightly in his chair, which for him was the equivalent of a gunshot. "Gentlemen, lady, you each had motive, however paltry, and opportunity, however brief. One of you is culpable. I will have it. Archie, you will pursue their alibis, examine their access, and return with particulars. By tomorrow evening, this will be resolved." The room erupted then, voices overlapping. Adrian's indignation, Mara's protest, Simon's scorn, Greaves's sputtering defense. Wolfe closed his eyes, lifted one hand, and the noise drained away as though he had pulled a stopper. "Leave," he said. "All of you. You will return when I summon. Archie will contact you." They filed out reluctantly, tension clinging to them like smoke. I saw Mara's eyes linger on Adrian, Simon's on Louise, Greaves's on his folder that now sat in Wolfe's possession. The brownstone was quiet again when the door closed, but the silence had changed. It was charged now, like the air before a storm. I turned to Wolfe. "Well?" He reached for his beer, poured it slow, and said, "One of them introduced a proteolytic agent to that Mousse. Not clumsily. Deliberately. Find which one, Archie. I will not tolerate sacrilege at the table." That was my cue. By morning I'd be knocking on doors, asking questions and turning over stones to see what wriggled underneath. The brownstone had been disturbed, and Wolfe had declared war, not over money, not over vanity, but over the violation of food. And I knew from long practice that when Wolfe takes something personally, the guilty party had better pray for mercy from someone else. If Wolfe declares war, you don't wait for drums, you lace your shoes. I left him with Fritz and the patient, sweating Mousse, and took a cab down to Vardel. Sunset put a bruise on the west side, and the city had its usual evening temper. Horns, steam, a whiff of burnt sugar from some street cart that couldn't hold a candle to Fritz, but did its best. Vardel sat on a block of polished ambition, brass letters clean enough to shave in, and a little vestibule where money caught its breath before being seated. Inside, a hostess with the right kind of posture recognized my name from Louise's call and slid me past a dining room setting up for service. It smelled the way a well-run kitchen ought to smell at 5:30. Hot metal, clean citrus, and something butter-forward that made me want to send Wolfe a postcard. Louise met me by the pass in a chef's coat as détente, uncreased as her face wasn't. She moved like she had memorized the restaurant and could turn corners without looking. "We'll start with pastry," she said, not wasting words, and led me down a corridor where the temperature dropped 2 degrees and the noise got firmer. Pastry was a peninsula off the main line. Steel table, separate reach-in, shelves of gleaming bowls and whisks, scales, thermometers, the little amber bottles of extracts lined like soldiers. There was a column that made a blind corner for 2 seconds if you were coming from the dish pit. I noted it. 2 seconds is a lifetime if your intention is that kind of thing. The sous chef, a woman with forearms that could whip cream by intimidation, introduced herself as Pia Morales and shook my hand once. She had the air of a person who made kitchens behave by looking at them. "We cleaned down the station after service," she said, "but left it as was otherwise. Leo is on his way in." "Good," I said. "Walk me through yesterday. 3 to service." "Gelatin scaled at 310, she said, pointing. "In that vein. Sheets bloomed in cold water, then warmed gently and folded into base. We stabilize mousse for banquet service. You can fight physics, or you can respect it." She had that for a motto somewhere. Probably her bones. Cream came up cold at 4. No separation. Leo whipped. Adrian checked the peak. He folded. I saw him do it. She didn't add that she wished she hadn't. Who touched pastry? Who shouldn't? "No one should," she said flatly. But should didn't run last night. The manager's corridor was a parade. Your investor and her critic twice, the ex-husband once. He had flowers. I told him to keep moving. He didn't move as fast as I liked. "The column makes a blind spot," I said. "It does," she admitted. "We rely on bodies, not cameras. We are reconsidering." Something on the lower shelf caught my eye. It was nothing. A little crescent of dried something almost the color of old straw on the lip of a mixing bowl. I bent, sniffed, and didn't get chocolate. I got something faintly sweet and wrong, the way a smile is wrong when the eyes don't sign the contract. I didn't taste it. Wolfe was particular about what I put in my mouth for him. The apprentice arrived then, a narrow kid with careful hands and the look of someone who measures his words the way he measures his sugar. "Leo," he said to me, as if the name were an apology. "Mrs. Vardell said you had questions." "I do," I told him, "and I like facts." "They don't argue. 3 o'clock to plating." He gave it to me like he'd been practicing in his head since last night. Scaled gelatin at 310. Pia checked. Bloom was clean, base at 330. Adrian tested the temp with his finger, he always does. Whipped cream at 410. Peaks at 430. Adrian folded and finished at 5. I set cups. We covered and walked them to the walk-in. They were fine. Any interruptions? 2, he said, and the fact he had the number ready made me like him. First, Adrian stepped out to show the critic a quenelle, because Ms. Kincaid wanted him to. I kept folding under Pia's eye. Second, Mr. Greaves came by asking about timed service. He wanted to bump dessert earlier for the critics' table. Adrian said no. "Anyone touch your tools?" I asked. "Whisks, spatulas?" He shook his head, then hesitated. "The spatula wasn't where I left it. I don't know if I misremembered. We were in a rush. I found it on the dish rack. It looked clean. I didn't use it. I washed another." "Good," Pia said, curt. It was approval from an economy model. "Any fruit near pastry?" I said. "Pineapple, papaya, kiwi." He frowned, searching the day. "No, chef," he said reflexively, and flushed. "Sorry, no, sir. We didn't run tropical, but garde-manger had fruit for staff. A vendor gifted a box. I saw kiwi on a sheet tray by the ice machine. That's the corridor." Ms. Kincaid's assistant grabbed a piece on the fly. She made a face and tossed the peel in pastry trash. I told her not to eat in my station. "Did you fish the peel out?" I asked. He looked stricken. Number I should have. "Maybe it didn't matter," I said, and didn't say maybe it mattered very much. "Do you eat kiwi?" He nodded. "I do. Adrian doesn't. He says it makes his tongue buzz." Pia's eyes met mine for half a second. "Kiwi is a teacher if you're listening. Actinidin doesn't care about careers." "Show me dry storage," I said, and Pia led the way. Dry storage was what it ought to be. Cool, orderly, labeled. Sugar lived with sugar. Flour minded its manners. On a mid-shelf, a squat white tub with a red lid sulked among baking powder and salt. The label said, tender fast in cheerful letters that had never met a ribeye they didn't want to hug. I lifted it, lighter than full. The foil under the lid had been peeled back and pressed down again with the particular care of someone who wanted you to think they didn't exist. "That's new," Pia said. Her voice gave you nothing, but the veins on the back of her hands showed. "We don't use that. We brine, we marinate. We don't cheat." "Who ordered it?" "Greaves," she said, "for a skirt steak special. He said it makes cheaper cuts sing. I told him our cuts don't need choir practice." I made a note. "Who put it here?" She didn't know. Dry storage is community property, and communities have freeloaders. We had enough for the first pass. I left them and found the bar manager, a woman named Tilly with shoulders like a swimmer's and an attitude that suggested she had ejected better people than me. She softened when I told her who sent me and hardened again when I asked about cameras. "We're a restaurant, not Fort Knox," she said. But she did produce a monitor and a thumb drive and a stubborn patience while we watched a split-screen summary of a day that had already been felt too hard. At 3:12, Leo scaled gelatin, neat and precise. At 4:05, Adrian did a little ballet with a bowl and an ego, then drifted out of frame toward the dining room. A minute later, Mara Kincaid shepherded a man with critic's posture past pastry with a smile that made men forgiving. Pia hovered like a hawk. At 4:18, the corridor filled. A server with plates, a runner with a crate, a manager with a clipboard, and a man with a vase, large and absurd, coming from the loading dock direction. He was on camera for 3 seconds. He turned the vase to protect the blooms and his hand. His right came briefly into frame on the pastry shelf as he adjusted his grip. Heavy ring, square face. The resolution wasn't polite enough to tell me the crest, but it didn't need to. I had seen a square signet earlier that day on a man who disliked wasting effort. "Run that again," I said, until he did. Twice. The hand touched the shelf like it belonged there. Pia, on the far side of the column, had her body aimed away for a breath and might as well have been on Mars. "You keeping that?" Tilly asked. "If you let me," I said. "You'll bring it back," she told me, which is about as close to love as some New Yorkers get. I promised, and she burned me a copy of the segment. I made 2 other stops on the block. The first was the florist listed on the invoice Greaves had clipped to the order sheet, the perks of having your manager's folder. I asked the owner, a man with clippers like surgical steel, if a Simon Dacre had purchased flowers for delivery. He frowned at his book. "Picked up," he corrected. "At 3:40. Bright arrangement. No delivery. Said he had to get it to a, what did he say, passer? Pass? Kitchen pass. He knew the term. Did he ask for anything edible?" I said. I was not suggesting he arranged papayas with daisies, but I wanted the word in the air. The florist made a face as if I had asked him to garnish peonies with ketchup. Number he wanted lilies and snapdragons and a spray of tropical greens. Monstera, bird of paradise. Said she liked drama. He handed me the carbon of the receipt. There was a little smear of something yellow on the corner. Pollen, probably. I slid it into my notebook. The second stop was a bodega whose manager had the look of a man who has learned to draw conclusions quickly about people in need of cigarettes and fruit at the same time. I showed him a photo of Ms. Kincaid's assistant from the restaurant's staff board. Every place has one, a family tree with allergies, and asked if she'd picked up anything weird yesterday. "She grabs juices," he said. "Green, orange. Yesterday. Kiwi. I remember because she asked if it was the fuzzy kind. I told her they all are." Back at Vardell, I took one more look where habits live, in the trash. Pastry's can had been emptied after service and relined neat, but the recycling hadn't. On top sat a plastic clamshell with a produce sticker, half peeling, "Hayward Kiwi, Golden Sun Farms." It was innocent as a hymn and might not mean a thing. Or it might mean everything if some busy hand had peeled and then touched a bowl lip, and then time did what it always does. On my way out, I caught a last word with Leo. "When Adrian stepped out," I said, "how long were you alone?" He cringed, like I'd asked him how long he'd left a child in a car. "Maybe 3 minutes. Pia was in the walk-in. Adrian was with the critic. I turned to get a new spatula. When I turned back, the bowl was where I left it. I swear I didn't see anyone touch it." "You saw Simon?" "In the corridor. He said, 'Make it real island smooth,' and smiled." Leo swallowed. I didn't know what that meant. "It meant he wanted to be remembered," I said. He succeeded. I called Wolfe from the sidewalk with the city leaning in to listen. He let me give him the lot without interrupting, which he does when the mosaic is starting to suggest a face. When I got to the signet ring and the tub of tenderfast and the kiwi clamshell, he made a noise that in another man would be 3 words. "Go on." "Greaves ordered tenderizer for skirt steak," I said. "Open tub found on pastry shelf. Either laziness or plant. Video shows Dacre's ringed hand on that shelf for a beet with flowers. Kincaid's assistant snacking kiwi, peel in pastry trash. Adrian was off preening for the critic for 3 minutes he didn't mention. Leo found a spatula out of place and didn't use it. Pia is a human metronome and misses nothing except what a column denies." Wolfe said. "If I allow that, actinidine will disrobe your gelatin, kiwi. The question becomes whether a peel in a bin is negligence or theatre. If papin or bromelain, tenderizer, an open tub is either temptation or trap. Mr. Dacre's ring, he is gauche enough to garnish an injury with his insignia. And Mr. LaSalle's omission about his absence is either vanity or self-preservation. I do not yet wish to apportion. I wish to arrange." He took a slow breath, and I could hear in it the orchids above his head, the beer the color of self-respect, and the office that had returned to attention. "Return. Bring me the tub. Bring me the recording. Bring me the receipt from the florist. And bring your nose. We will do a little experiment." "On a full stomach," I said. "On a righteous one," he answered, and hung up. I made a last sweep. Dry storage for the tub. Sealed it in a bag like it had dignity. Tilly for the drive. She told me again to bring it back, I promised. The florist for the carbon. He wiped his clippers to get me the smudge-free copy and handed me the smudged one because I asked for the ugly. Then I stepped out into the evening. The block had warmed into chatter and clink and the rumor of sauce. I had the kind of haul that doesn't look like much in a stranger's hands and makes Wolfe's fingers itch. In the cab uptown, I watched the city reflect itself in the window and reviewed the pieces. Every one of our quartet had reached for the pastry station in one way or another, by hand, by order, by ego, by narrative. If the kitchen was a chessboard, I could see now who had advanced a pawn, who had castled, who had flicked a knight into a dangerous square for the pleasure of the move. I didn't know yet who had tipped a drop of ruin into a bowl, but I knew what kind of person it was. The kind who thinks a spoon is a weapon because it leaves no mark you can point to in the daylight. When I let myself back into the brownstone, the air had that charged quality it gets when Wolfe is thinking hard enough to make the books listen. He didn't look up when I came in. He didn't need to. I put the tub on the desk, the drive beside it, the receipt on the blotter, and waited while he finished a thought. "Good," he said finally, as if I were a dish that had held its shape. "Now we will see which of our guests brought sacrilege to the table with forethought and malice, and which merely set a place for it." Which was Wolfe's way of saying the next move was his. And when he moves from his chair, everyone else in the room moves with him, even if they think they're standing still. Wolfe had the tub of tenderizer sitting on his desk like it was a dignitary called in for questioning. He gave it the same half-lidded regard he reserves for an orchid with a new bloom, something he respects but doesn't quite trust. I set the florist's carbon and the thumb drive beside it, neat as pieces on a chessboard. Wolfe doesn't appreciate drama in presentation. He prefers symmetry. Pfui, he muttered, nudging the tub with a finger. If this was used, it was either crude or cunning. Either way, contemptible. He gestured, and Fritz appeared with a tray, 2 small porcelain bowls, cream chilled to a glossy ripple, and a packet of gelatin leaves already blooming in cold water. "You're making mousse," I said. "I'm demonstrating sabotage," Wolfe corrected. He nodded at Fritz, who moved with the reverence of a priest before an altar. He warmed the base, stirred, folded, and split the result into 2 bowls. Wolfe watched every motion, his bulk settled deep into the chair, his eyes hooded but sharp. "Archie," he said, "a droplet." He indicated the tub. I pried it open. The smell was faint but distinct, the way a butcher's counter smells on a humid day. I took a clean spoon, lifted a dusting, and let it fall like ash into one of the bowls. Fritz folded once, twice, careful as surgery. The other bowl remained pure. We set both in the small refrigerator behind the cabinet. Wolfe had a stopwatch already in his hand. He pressed it with a decisive click. "We will observe." The next hour went the way it always does when Wolfe is running an experiment. He had me record intervals. 5 minutes, 10, 15. At 12 minutes, the doctored bowl began to slump. At 18, it looked like soup in morning. The control held its peaks with the dignity of a soldier at attention. "There," Wolfe said. He folded his hands. "Satisfied. Papain, or bromelain. Not kiwi. Tenderizer." "Which means," I began. "It means," he interrupted, "that Mr. Greaves introduced into his restaurant an enzyme suitable for destruction. He may have done so himself, or it may have been appropriated by another. The evidence points, but does not yet indict. That distinction is mine to refine." I watched the mousse continue its collapse, slow and inevitable. Wolfe drank his beer, the foam clinging stubbornly to the rim, and I thought about the way he called food a social contract. When you tamper with that contract, you don't just ruin dessert. You declare war on trust. The phone rang at 8. Wolfe flicked his eyes at me, and I picked it up. It was Louise, her voice tight. "Archie, someone was in my office. Papers moved, nothing missing, but I know the order of my desk. Adrian swears he locked the back door, but the latch was undone. I don't know if it was threat or warning." I relayed this to Wolfe. He closed his eyes, not in weariness, but in calculation. "Tell her to secure everything," he said, "and to wait. We will summon." I passed on the message. She exhaled like a diver surfacing, thanked me, and hung up. Wolfe reached for the florist's receipt, turned it once, and tapped the yellow smear of pollen with his forefinger. "Archie, observe, Mr. Dacre purchased flowers containing tropical foliage, monstera, bird of paradise, commonly shipped with preservatives in the water. Some of those preservatives include bromelain, pineapple enzymes. It is conceivable that in arranging, in vainglorious display, he transferred residue to pastry tools, but improbable, too indirect, too dependent on chance." "Then Greaves is our man," I said. Wolfe shook his head, a mountain shifting an inch. "Not yet. Greaves ordered tenderfast. That does not convict him of misapplying it. He may be incompetent. He may be guilty." Adrian concealed his absence. Ms. Kincaid paraded a critic through sacred ground. Mr. Dacre handled a shelf he had no right to touch. Each has dirt on his hands, but only one, set out to defile. That is the one we seek. He drank again, set the glass down, and looked at me. "You will dig deeper. Speak with Ms. Kincaid's assistant. You will visit Mr. Dacre in his lair. You will press Mr. Greaves about his procurement, and you will test Mr. LaSalle's vanity. A liar's reflection can be coaxed into speech if you hold the mirror long enough. So that's what I did. The next morning, I started with the assistant. Her name was Polly Hammond, a 20-something with a vocabulary of hashtags and a handbag that cost 3 months of my rent. She met me at a cafe near Union Square, sipping a matcha latte and pretending to be unimpressed. "You want to know about kiwi?" she said, before I asked. "Yes, I ate one. I was starving. Service was dragging. Adrian was screaming about peaks and folds. I grabbed a slice from the tray by the ice machine. Big deal." "Big enough?" I said. "You toss the peel in pastry trash." Her eyes flicked. "So what if I did?" "Kiwi has an enzyme," I said. "Breaks down gelatin. A few smears on a spatula and—" She cut me off with a laugh that had no music. "Oh, please. You think I'm some criminal mastermind with fruit? I didn't even know that. I was hungry, that's all." She might have been telling the truth. But the problem with assistants is they often do what they're told, even when they don't understand the consequences. From there, I went to see Simon Dacre. He had a flat in Midtown with furniture that tried to look expensive and only succeeded in being loud. He poured himself a scotch at 10 a.m. and offered me one. I declined. "You think I ruined her Mousse," he said, settling into a leather chair. "I didn't. Louise doesn't need me to ruin her. She'll do it herself, with her pride and her stubbornness. She always did." "You carried flowers through her kitchen," I reminded him. He smirked. "And I touched a shelf. So what? I didn't sprinkle poison. If I wanted to hurt her, I'd do it in court, not in chocolate." "Yet you made a remark to the apprentice," I said. "Island smooth." What did that mean? His smirk widened. It meant nothing. I like words. I liked seeing the boys sweat, that's all. Don't make poetry out of it. I left him with his scotch and his bitterness. He was a man who would sabotage with words, not enzymes, unless he wanted to surprise me. By noon, I was at Greaves's office, a corner of the restaurant stacked with binders and invoices. He was there, sleeves rolled, forehead damp, balancing numbers like plates. He didn't look happy to see me. "That tub," I said, setting it on his desk. "Tenderfast. Why did you order it?" He bristled. "Because costs matter. Not every diner orders prime rib. We run specials. A little help makes the meat tender, saves money. Standard practice." "Standard practice isn't putting it in pastry dry storage," I said. "Who shelved it?" He looked honestly baffled. "I don't know. Probably a porter. They don't always listen. But I never told anyone to use it for Mousse. That's insane." "Insane, yes," I said. "But possible." He ran a hand over his thinning hair. "Look, Archie, I keep the place running. Adrian preens, Mara meddles, Simon sulks. I don't have time to play saboteur. If someone used that tub, it wasn't me." I left him sweating behind his ledgers and went to my last stop. Adrian's loft in Soho. It was everything you'd expect. Glass, chrome, and cookbooks stacked like trophies. He opened the door in a silk robe and a smile that belonged on stage. "Archie Goodwin," he said, ushering me in. "Come to taste genius in exile." "Come to hear truth in hiding," I corrected. "Why didn't you mention you stepped away from pastry during Mousse prep?" His smile flickered, then recovered. "Because it was trivial. Mara insisted I dazzle her critic. I gave him a demonstration. 3 minutes, no harm." 3 minutes, I said, in which anyone could have touched your bowls. "Why conceal it?" He waved a hand. "Because it would sound negligent, and I'm not negligent. I'm a victim. Someone wanted me humiliated. It worked." "Any guesses who?" His eyes glittered. "Greaves. He resents me. He thinks numbers matter more than art. He would kill chocolate if it meant saving pennies." I didn't press. He'd already said enough. Back at the brownstone, I laid it all out for Wolfe. Polly's kiwi, Dacre's flowers, Greaves's tub, Adrian's absence. Wolfe listened with his eyes closed, nodding once, twice. When I finished, he opened them and looked at me as if I'd just set a tray of evidence instead of words. "Good," he said. "Now we have 4 vectors. Kiwi, tub, foliage, vanity. Each leads to an open door. But only one was used." He tapped the tenderizer. "This one. We proved it. Now the question is, who knew enough, dared enough, and gained enough to use it?" I asked him if he had the answer. He shook his head once. "Not yet. But they will all return tomorrow, and in this room, Archie, no Mousse will melt unseen." Which was Wolfe's way of promising the noose was already tightening, and all I had to do was keep the suspects dancing until he was ready to pull it. If you think experiments and a tub of tenderfast tuck Wolfe in for the night, you haven't watched him when he smells doctrine in a crime. He let Fritz clear the bowls, one proud, one disgraced, and told me, without opening his eyes, that I was not to go to bed until I had made a call. Saul answered on the second ring, which meant either he was home or somewhere civilized. If he had been in a hole, it would have taken 3. "Saul," I said, "we've got a kitchen sacrilege." Wolfe wants 4 threads pulled until they squeal. "Greaves, why the tub, and who else put hands on it?" "Mara. What's she selling and to whom?" "Adrian, vanity appointments and side doors." "Dacre, resentments with expense accounts." "There's also an anonymous health department complaint that just called Louise to say they'll be by in the morning, which is a cute way to push a woman toward a cliff. Track the complaint's trail if there is one." "Got it," Saul said. "You don't need to tell Saul how to be discreet. He can vanish in a room full of mirrors. You at the brownstone. For about as long as it takes me to get my hat. Wolfe will be at his desk until the world ends. I'll be at Vardell when the city wakes up to judge. We have a silent truce with mornings. I don't love them and they don't insist on loving me back, but I showed up at Vardell at 8 when the block smelled like bread and hose water. Louise met me at the door with a clipboard and a face that had been ironed back into composure. You could still see the crease. "They say 9, she said. "Anonymous complaint. Food safety, temperature logs, pest control, the usual threats said like blessings." "Anonymous my foot," I told her. "When a complaint picks the morning after sabotage, it's got fingerprints even if they wore gloves. We'll give them a tour worthy of Versailles. In the meantime, I want to look at the pastry aisle and everything that pretends it isn't part of pastry, but wants to stand close." She nodded, and we went to the peninsula. The station had been reset to showroom. Pia was already on the field, sleeves rolled, eyes clear. Leo, solemn as a monk, was taking temperatures and calling out numbers to the sheet. I did not touch a thing with my hands. I looked, which is a better tool if you use it right. The white tub of tenderfast was no longer in dry. Louise had moved it to her office safe overnight on my say-so, which told me she was still capable of taking advice, a quality that separates clients from casualties. The trouble with kitchens is they are full of containers that want to look like other containers. On a spice shelf behind the extracts, something the size of a parchment sachet didn't belong. I asked permission, got it, and used 2 fingers on the edge to tip it into a stainless bowl. Fine powder. Not sugar. A sniff said, "Butcher's locker room again." The fold-over crease at the top had been sealed with the lick of a tongue that didn't know I was going to see it. I bagged it. Leo's eyes followed the move, not with guilt, but with the kind of shame people feel when their home has a hole in the wall they never noticed. "Good," Pia said dryly. "If we keep discovering these, we can open a grocery." "The inspector can discover this one or not," I said. "If they do, you let me talk. If they don't, it will still help us." "Help us with what?" she said. "With telling a story that ends with a person and not a process." She gave me a look that meant we were on the same side until we weren't, which is the best you can ask of a Sioux who knows her job. At 9:07 the inspectors arrived, two of them, one with a clipboard and the other with a pen that had written more closures than sonnets. I did my Archie Goodwin special, which consists of being helpful without letting anyone stir. Louise did her version, which is to perform competence so convincingly that incompetence gets embarrassed and goes home. We showed logs, thermometers, gaskets. The walk-ins were at temp. The coolers hummed like they'd been paid to. In dry, the inspector's pen hovered over empty space where the tender-fast tub would have been if we had wanted to stage an arrest. He glanced at the spice shelf, then at me. I looked bored. That helped. He still found a ding. You can't let government out of your kitchen without feeding it something. 2 cracked tiles near the dish pit. He wrote them up with the gravity of a judge handling high treason, told Louise to fix them and send proof, and left behind that damp fear that even a passing score makes when it could have been closure. When they were gone, my phone said Saul had left 3 crumbs for me to follow. The first said Greaves had met a rep from Morrow Foods at a diner on 11th at 11 the night before the Mousse, had accepted samples in a white paper bag, paid cash for a rush order, and asked questions that were not about skirt steak. The second said Polly, the assistant who considered Kiwi a personality trait, had been seen across from Vardell at 8 last night with a man holding a small camera on a monopod, the kind of rig that likes to catch behind the scenes. Disasters. The third said Dacre had parked his ring at a bar on 3rd, where he told a bartender too much scotch that she always melts down eventually, which in a jury makes you look poetic and guilty and in real life just makes you look sloppy. I gave Wolfe the whole report in the spice sachet, and he gave me a grunt that was as close as he gets to patting my head. "The bag," he said, "vindicates my nose. Your inspector deserves thanks for his incuriosity. Mr. Greaves's nocturne with Morrow is interesting. If he didn't do it, he arranged the stage dressing. Ms. Kincaid's assistant filming the carcass of your reputation is not a kindness. Mr. Dacre will incriminate himself with metaphors until the sun goes out. Phooey, we will accelerate. Saul's still on their tails, I told him. He'll tell me if someone tries an encore." The encore started writing itself before lunch. Louise called. Someone had jimmied the latch on the back door again, this time cleanly, with care, and migrated through her office without taking a thing, except that the stack of menu proofs on her desk had been adjusted, and on the top one, someone had underlined chocolate mousse, Santo Domingo. 70% in a pencil so faint you needed guilt to read it. Not a threat. A note left for the person reading notes. "Tell her," Wolfe said, "to leave it undisturbed and to keep her hands off anything that looks like a message. We will collect all messages in this office, where temptations have fewer entry points." He tugged the bell cord. "Fritz, 2 bowls? Repeat yesterday." We ran the experiment again, this time with a pinch from my parchment bag. The Mousse folded and then bowed out of existence on schedule. Wolfe watched it like a priest placing blame on a saint's impostor. "Enough," he said finally. "We are done with enzymes. We turn to humans." By mid-afternoon, Saul had a bow for one of his crumbs. Morrow Foods, the vendor Greaves met, had a caller ID service at the head office that logged Greaves' voicemail Monday asking about reapplication protocols. The message was saved. Saul obtained a recording because Saul can pass through locked doors without leaving a crease on the jamb. Greaves' voice asked if a light dusting would be enough to break a gelatin set, and the rep cheerfully explained household chemistry like a camp counselor talking about s'mores. The date stamp was 48 hours before the sabotage. That makes a man sweat, but it doesn't end the dance. Greaves could plausibly say he was asking so nobody else did it. Cops see that story a lot from men who read poison labels after they pour. Wolfe listened to the recording twice and put it in his desk as if closing the lid on a jar with a hornet that isn't done stinging yet. At 4, I swung by the block again and did what I do best, stood where people can see me, and pretended to be scenery. Polly came out of a coffee place with her matcha. A young man with a camera case across his back peeled off from a parked sedan and joined her. They spoke in the fast, flat tones of people who spend their lives narrating. I drifted closer to a lamp post and heard just enough. "We need another beat. The health thing didn't close them. If we get a second failure on film, it's a series." The young man said, "Adrian will play. He hates the chef coat but loves the lens." Polly said, "Mara wants momentum." I didn't stop them. I didn't borrow the camera. I didn't even frown. I wrote it down for Wolfe, and his mouth did a little line like a hat brim. "They are staging," he said. "They do not know who performed. They do not care who did. They want spectacle. Do not interfere. We will deny them their climax and give them a denouement that will make them wish for silence." At 5, Saul checked in again, sleek and pleased. He had trailed Adrian to a cafe at lunch where Mara Kincaid and a producer from a streaming series called City Eats were waiting with a contract thick enough to stop a bullet. The working title on the page was La Salle Unbound, and there were words like exclusive and exit strategy and post-incident narrative. Saul said Adrian's smile would have lit a kitchen without electricity. He also said Adrian didn't sign then. He preened. He negotiated a clause about ownership of recipes. He flicked a page where penalties lived, and he left with the contract because he is not completely stupid. That, Wolfe said, is a motive with frosting. If Ms. Kincaid needs a drama to pry a chef loose from his employer while raising his profile, a Mousse collapse with cameras ready is efficient. Yet Adrian's absence and his vanity, he could arrange his own martyrdom and claim triumph from ashes. Fouet. We will decide which one prefers puppets and which prefers strings. Archie, telephone. Summon them. Tonight. I suggested tomorrow would give me time to catch a nap and a shave. Wolfe suggested with his eyebrows that my pillow could wait. He dictated the times: 8 for Greaves, 8:15 for Adrian, 8:30 for Mara, 8:45 for Dacre, and then he added, "And tell Mrs. Vardell to arrive at 7:50 and sit in the corner and not make speeches." Which I did, and she agreed because she could smell that we were close to something ready to be taken out of the oven. Before I left the phone, Wolfe said, "One more thing. You will tell each, separately, that my preliminary conclusion points to kiwi, actinidin, the delicate culprit. Let them bask in their preferred exoneration. Watch what they do with the reprieve. Mr. Greaves will relax. Mr. LaSalle will preen. Ms. Kincaid will plot. Mr. Dacre will sneer. The one who moves to amplify kiwi will betray himself by arranging a second demonstration. We will be ready for it." "You want me to bait a saboteur into trying again," I said. "In our house." "In my house," he corrected, "but not with my food." He looked at Fritz. "We will prepare 2 sets, one as before, with proper respect. One decoy, prepared to fail at a chosen moment under our control. The saboteur will take credit for what he did not do and commit himself to what he cannot escape. You can say what you like about Wolfe, but when he chooses theater, he writes the ending and then hands out scripts that look like secrets." Fritz took the order like a man baptized in a faith he trusts. Mousse, perfect. Mousse, destined to die with dignity at a time announced by a clock only we could see. He also assembled a second decoy, a bowl that would surrender only if you dusted it with a particular friend from a particular parchment bag. The bag went into my pocket, the spoon for the dusting into another. If any hand reached for our sanctity, it would have to do it right in front of a man who shoots straight with words. At 7:45, the office smelled faintly of chocolate and confidence. The cups sat on a side table under glass domes like jeweled brides. The beer had its condensation halo. The doorbell told me our parade had begun. When I opened the door to Louise, she looked like someone who had slept between two adjectives, stubborn and scared, and decided to get up anyway. I put her where Wolfe had told me and warned her with my eyes that any speeches would be taxed. Greaves arrived first, creased and nervous. Adrian next, cologne first, and then cheekbones. Mara third, with a smile like a signature. Dacre last, contempt poured into a suit. When they had all taken chairs, Wolfe approved. He opened his eyes. He did not stand. He did not speak at first. He let the brownstone do what it does. Compress egos, amplify lying, and make the truth itch. When he did speak, it was in that mild tone that moves men toward cliffs without making them feel pushed. He said he had been contemplating enzymes and human pettiness. He said kiwi was an elegant explanation. He said he favored elegance. He said the office of Nero Wolfe would be pleased to demonstrate. He gestured toward the domes. I lifted one. The Mousse quivered like a violin note. Wolfe glanced at the clock. He was counting down a failure he owned. Observe, he said. At the proper interval, sabotage produces an aesthetic degradation. He raised a finger. Now. I saw 3 faces eager for collapse and one, Louise's, that I didn't let myself look at. I also saw 2 hands twitch with the second hand. Greaves's toward his tie, Adrian's toward his hair. Mara didn't twitch. She watched the room, not the dessert. Dacre smirked because some men are born smirking and die that way. The Mousse did not fall. Not yet. Wolfe folded his fingers, looked half asleep, and waited for the saboteur to try to make the world match the story in his head. And because saboteurs believe in magic after they've practiced it once, one of our guests moved, a small, impatient movement with a big opinion behind it, reaching for what he thought was an unguarded spoon. My hand was faster. I picked up the spoon and, as if obligingly helping the demonstration, dusted the decoy with a pinch from my pocket and set the spoon down again. The saboteur's hand stalled, then retreated, guilty of nothing except the motion. Wolfe said, "Now," again, and the decoy sighed and slumped just enough to make Mara's pupils widen, and Greaves's shoulders drop, and Adrian's mouth part, and Dacre's smirk grow, because nothing confirms a belief like a miracle at your command. Wolfe watched reactions as if the Mousse were a mirror. The man who had reached just slightly had to swallow relief like it was a hot stone. Wolfe closed his eyes, satisfied, and drank his beer. "Good," he said. "Now that we have seen your appetite, we will satisfy mine." Wolfe didn't change key, he just altered tempo. He let their eyes sit on the slumped decoy for 1 beat longer than was polite, then shifted his gaze to the only thing in the room more immovable than his chair, Evan Greaves' face when it tries not to move. "Mr. Greaves," he said as if calling roll, "you met a representative from Morrow Foods the evening before this mischief. You accepted samples. You inquired 48 hours before the event about reapplication protocols. Your voice is on an obliging voicemail explaining that a light dusting will disable a gelatin set. You ordered a tub of tenderfast and placed it, deliberately or by negligence, in dry storage for pastry. Why?" Greaves' shoulders had already dropped for the decoy's performance. Now they attempted the opposite and discovered there wasn't room. Costs, he began, and swallowed. "Skirt steak. Specials. Everyone does." "No," Wolfe said, and the word was so soft it made the rest of Greaves' sentence go hide. "Everyone does not. Not in that kitchen. Your everyone is a lie you have told yourself so often that it feels like policy. You do not answer, why did the tenderizer travel from receiving to pastry? Who repackaged it into a sachet and put it on a shelf behind the extracts where a hurried hand could find it? He could have let the silence do the choking. He didn't need to. Greaves opened his mouth, shut it, then remembered the folder he didn't have. A porter misshelved it, he tried. I didn't. Please, Wolfe said, almost kindly. A porter does not fold paper and lick the crease. A porter does not ask about breaking a gelatin set. A porter does not reach for a spoon at the exact instant he believes kiwi should fail, and then swallow relief when fate intervenes. Archie. I don't get to testify often. When I do, I enjoy it. At your now, he moved, I said. Left hand half a foot off the arm of the chair. Not a flinch, intent. The kind of reach a man makes when he has done it before and trusts muscle more than magic. He aborted when he saw me reach first. Then he remembered to breathe. Shoulders dropped. That was at 8:14 by your clock. Greaves' eyes snapped to me. I adjusted my tie. You did after, I told him. You reached before. Wolfe let that hang just long enough to catch, then turned his head a quarter inch to give Adrien LaSalle his turn on the spit. Mr. LaSalle, you concealed an absence from your station at a critical juncture. You allowed Ms. Kincaid and her pet to parade you at your own bench while others folded what you would sign. Your vanity created opportunity. It does not, today, condemn you. Adrien, who had been riding the decoys, collapsed like a surfer, faltered, then remembered he was beautiful. I did nothing, he said, and arranged innocence on his face like garnish. I make art. I was humiliated. You were careless, Wolfe said, and you are a liar by omission. You have danced very close to felony to secure a camera, but you lacked either the stomach or the particular knowledge to reach for protein where it lives. You knew kiwi tingles on your tongue. You did not know papain does not. Adrien's mouth opened again and then decided to keep the air it had. Wolfe's eyes slid to Mara Kincaid. He does not look at people. He rests his attention on them like weight. Ms. Kincaid, you disguised intrusion as marketing. You invited a critic into the kitchen against your employer's instruction. You positioned a camera across the street with your assistant to capture disaster. You or yours lodged an anonymous complaint with the health department this morning from a VoIP number that resolves to a billing identity employed by your firm. You prepared the stage. You did not load the prop gun. Mara didn't blanch. She'd learned that trick before she learned to walk in those shoes, but the smile she keeps for photographers got edges. I protect investments, she said. Press is oxygen. Louise runs the kitchen. I feed the story. If the department heard a rumor and investigated, that is the system doing its job. If my assistant films what happens on a public street, that's life. You can't indict gravity. I don't, Wolfe said. I indict vanity when it believes itself necessity. Do not interrupt again until I ask you a question with a mark at the end. Her eyes flashed. Her mouth obeyed. And you, he said to Simon Dacre without changing temperature, handled a shelf with a ringed hand and left a conversation with a child you wished to see sweat. You are spiteful, and your ring is a stamp you enjoy more than the right to enjoy it. But you did not bring pineapple to a pastry bench with foresight. You wouldn't labor that hard to be petty. Dacre gave him a thin smile. Is that an acquittal? It is contempt, Wolfe said. Do not confuse them. You could feel the room trying to rearrange itself around those lines, like furniture being slid a few inches to make space for a new rug. Louise held very still in her corner, because if she moved, she might shatter. Fritz, in the doorway with a tray, had that expression he gets when the oven door stays shut while bread rises. Faith plus a timer. I stayed where I always do, a foot from the desk and a mile from any man's intentions. Wolfe extended a hand for the thumb drive without looking at me. I put it in his palm. He did not insert it. This is not a courtroom. We don't switch on machines for applause. He pinched the drive between finger and thumb as if it were a single seed. This, he said, contains an image of Mr. Dacre's hand on a pastry shelf at a moment of opportunity. It is admissible to explain laughter, not causation. I do not require it. I require this. He tapped the tub with a thick finger. Mr. Greaves's voice and Mr. Greaves's procurement, and this. He tapped the parchment packet on the blotter. Found in pastry, folded by a mouth, and this. He tapped the air where Greaves's hand had reached. Gesture. The human body is a chorus of unrequested truths. You sang. Greaves had kept himself from slumping by clamping onto anger like a life preserver. You don't have proof, he said. His control cracked on the last word. You have conjecture and theater. You put on a trick and want me to confess to the magic. Pfui, Wolfe said, and I was grateful for the word. It cleared the air. I do not trick. I test. I told you, Kiwi, to see who would attempt a repetition. Only one of you moved to participate, because only one of you knew it had not been Kiwi and feared the failure would not arrive on cue. Your insurance hand twitched toward my spoon. You wanted to dust what you had dusted before. It is adequate. Adrian couldn't help himself. He made a little triumphant sound. Wolfe didn't even tilt his head. Hush. If vanity were a crime, Broadway would be Alcatraz. Mara found her voice again. Dialed down, 2 stops. Evan, she said, like they were alone. Tell them you didn't. That was calculated. It gave Greaves a path, denied to the only person who could salvage his position with a headline. He took it. I didn't, he said to her, and then to Louise. I didn't. I would never endanger a guest. I was trying to manage risk. Adrian is chaos. I needed leverage to make changes. I wanted him exposed as unreliable so you would... He stopped, a second too late to save the word. Wolfe's eyebrows climbed 0.5 millimeter. So she would what? He asked, silk on wire. Reconsider him, Greaves said low. Reconsider expansion, too. Mara's money only comes if we hit targets. We weren't. Look, I didn't want illness. I didn't want harm. I wanted embarrassment. Enough to force a conversation. The critic laughs. Adrian looks a fool. Louise admits we need structure. Structure, Wolfe repeated, tasting it as if it were a spice he distrusted. You called the health department to threaten closure? I didn't, he said, and for once it sounded true. He cast a glance at Mara that she ignored. Polly's name tried to get born on his tongue and failed. Wolfe didn't pursue it because he didn't need to. He had marked that debt for another ledger. He leaned a fraction forward. You entered Mrs. Vardell's office twice at night without taking anything, leaving the latch tender and underlining a line on a menu in a pencil shade chosen for nerves. You wished to rattle, not steal. You wanted fear as an ingredient. Greaves's jaw moved. He picked an anger that felt safer. She gave him everything, he said, not looking at Adrian, looking at Louise. He runs the room. He ignores me. I make the machine work while he flirts with cameras. Money keeps asking for more seats. She refuses. I keep the doors open. I wanted... He choked on the next word and swallowed it back. Respect. Louise had been salt all evening. Now a little water showed. She kept her voice level. You tried to buy it with humiliation. He looked at his hands as if they were new to him. It wasn't supposed to get this far. It never is, Wolfe said. Treachery always intends restraint. The second dose. The controlled burn. You planned a second failure to confirm the first before an audience of little machines with lenses, and you would have had it if I had not provided you one without hazard. You provoked a government inspection to lean on reputation. You invited a critic to laugh so that your employer would fear. Mr. Greaves, you are the saboteur. You are also stupid. That combination is common and lethal. Mara's breath came out sharp. Adrian made another sound he should have swallowed. Dacre's smirk finally cracked and went flat. Louise closed her eyes once and opened them calmer. Greaves tried to stand. It wasn't wise. It made him look like a bad idea that wanted legs. You can't prove I touched it, he said. You can't put me in a courtroom with this and win. Wolfe didn't bother to stand to reduce him. He deadpanned it. A courtroom is not my immediate desire. I require satisfaction for my client's injury and for sacrilege in a kitchen. Here is what you will do." He lifted a finger and counted, not for his benefit, for Greaves's. "You will draft, in your handwriting, an account of your procurement, of your question tomorrow foods, of your placing of the tenderizer within reach in pastry, and your subsequent construction of a small packet intended for convenience, and of your movements the night of the failure. You will sign it. You will resign from Vardell with immediate effect and without severance. You will pay, personally, from funds that are yours, not the restaurant's or Ms. Kincaid's, a sum equal to 3 months' payroll to be distributed at Mrs. Vardell's discretion among her staff as hazard recompense. You will, if Mrs. Vardell chooses to bring the police, accept the legal consequences without performance." He turned his head a fraction. "Mrs. Vardell will decide whether to invite Inspector Kramer to this table. She may enjoy the sight of you under oath." Greaves' face did something complicated. Anger losing a brawl to panic. "That's extortion." "That is penance," Wolfe said. "You are at liberty to refuse. If you do, I will telephone Mr. Kramer now and provide him with the recording, the vendor, the packet, the tub, the anonymous complaint trace, the video of Mr. Dacre's hand, and Mr. Goodwin's observation of your involuntary rehearsal. He will gladly add his own menu of charges. Choose." The room held its breath like a choir that knows the note that comes next is high. Greaves looked at Mara as if she could purchase him out of physics. She looked at him as if she had just met him and didn't like the handshake. He looked at Adrian as if envy had a shape. Adrian looked at his cuticles. He looked at Louise and saw the man who had jimmied her latch looking back from her eyes. "I'll write," he said, and the words came out like he'd cracked a tooth on them. "Good," Wolfe said. "Archie, paper, ink. Not that pen, the other." He glanced at Fritz. "Beer." It wasn't for Greaves. While I set the paper just so on the blotter and placed the pen where a hand couldn't claim accident, Wolfe turned the gas under the final burners. He didn't look at Mara until Greaves had his head bent and the first sentence bleeding onto paper. Then he did. "Ms. Kincaid," he said, "you will take your cameras elsewhere. You will leave this restaurant to recover without your narrative. If you interfere again, I will produce for public consumption the trace of the complaint and the plan for a second beat. I suggest a profile piece on accountability." Mara's smile didn't return. The professional in her arranged a nod. "Understood," she said. And it was the first honest word she'd given us. "And you, Mr. LaSalle," Wolfe said, "will either do your work under Mrs. Vardell's authority, or you will go play at television and discover that attention does not emulsify. If you choose the camera, do it without sabotage to lend you sparkle." Adrian had enough sense to say only, "Yes, sir," and sound as if he'd meant it his whole life. "Mr. Dacre," Wolfe said and gave him his share, "learn that access is not entitlement. If you wish to see a kitchen again, wear eyes and leave your hands home." Dacre almost asked who would keep him from anything. Then he looked at me and thought better of it. Louise hadn't moved. "Mr. Wolfe," she said quietly, while Greaves's pen scratched, "I will think on Kramer." "You may," Wolfe said, and for him that was tenderness. "He will not mind being called tomorrow instead of tonight. He enjoys an evening's beer as much as I do." I watched Greaves write. There is a particular sound a confession makes when the writer is discovering his own sentences while he produces them, like a saw biting a knot in wood. He put down dates with starts over the numbers and wrote "I placed" once, and then tried "I put," and then returned to "I placed" as if grammar could commute. When he reached the part about the health department, he paused and stared at the wall. Mara did not rescue him. When he finished, he sat with the pen in his hand like he didn't know how to give it back. I took it. I read the pages because that's my job. The ink did what ink does. It removed options. Wolfe drank his beer, set it down, and let the office be a temple again. "We are done," he said. He did not dismiss them. He dismissed the subject. "Fritz, dinner. Archie, see our guests out." He opened his eyes to Louise, last, and gave her the only payment he respects from himself. A small nod that says you have been wronged, and I have taken the wrong and arranged it. I didn't think we were entirely done. There was still a question on the table about whether the law should chew on Greaves the way he had wanted the Mousse to collapse, and there was a last comment Wolfe had not minted yet. But for the moment, the brownstone exhaled the intruders, the cups under their domes held their shape, and the decoy sagged on its little plate like a villain after the lights go up. I got my hat. Tomorrow Kramer could have his piece. Tonight Wolfe had his, and it tasted the way justice does when it's served in courses. Seeing them out is part of the job. It also keeps my hands from doing something I'd regret. I started with Dacre, because he had the smirk that wants to linger. He tried a line about meltdowns being inevitable in art, and I suggested he try it in a courtroom with a district attorney who'd skip dessert. He decided the sidewalk needed him. Mara paused in the hall long enough to tell me, in a voice meant for microphones, that responsible leadership is about transparent narratives. I said the transparent narrative tonight was that she'd almost filmed herself out of a client. She gave me a look that might peel wallpaper and left, calling someone before my door shut. Adrian hovered, sleek and anxious, like a cat who wants to pretend it didn't knock over the vase. "Tell Mr. Wolfe he began. I told him to tell Wolfe himself by showing up on time tomorrow and making a Mousse that didn't need an audience. He nodded, which counts as humility in his species, and drifted away with his cheekbones at half-mast. Greaves went last because he had to pass his confession back to his pocket after Wolfe folded it into an envelope that had already decided where it would live if necessary. He tried to meet Louise's eyes. She didn't give him the chance. I opened the door. He stepped through. The brownstone took a long breath like a building that knows when a bad draft is gone. Louise didn't speak until the latch clicked. She came back in, stood in front of Wolfe's desk, and kept her hands at her sides like they were dangerous. "Thank you," she said. "Not the kind that means you bring flowers to a recital. The kind that means a doctor did something messy and necessary. I will sleep on Kramer." "Sleep," Wolfe said, which from him is practically an embrace. "Tomorrow is soon enough to invite bureaucracy to dinner." Fritz, who had been leaning in the doorway with the patience of a man who knows when to lift a lid, gave a little nod to the invisible dinner bell. We let the office empty of strangers, and then the house arranged itself in its old dimensions. In the dining room, Fritz sent out a roast chicken that would have made a monk break a vow and haricots verts that minded their manners. Wolfe ate with his usual devotion, which is not the same as speed. He doesn't debrief over food, he lets the palate have the floor. When a man worships, you don't whisper in the pew. Coffee came. He took the first sip with his eyes half closed, and then opened them enough to put me back on duty. "Options," he said. "She calls Kramer," I said, "and he arrives with a cigar and a warrant. Or she keeps the confession and the payroll, lets Greaves drift into obscurity, and Mara learns to film dog shows. Adrian either stays and learns to fold without fluttering, or takes his cheekbones to streaming and discovers ratings don't stabilize anything." He set the cup down. "She must decide whether the kitchen requires a public burning to sweeten its air." "I can get you a match," I said. "You can get me Inspector Kramer," he said, which is another flame entirely. "In the morning, 10. Mrs. Vardell will attend if she wishes to throw her oil on the fire." He didn't add and take responsibility for the heat. He didn't need to. Wolfe doesn't seize decisions that belong to clients. He arranges them, sets them at the place, and points to the knife. I called Saul to thank him for weaving straw into thread and to tell him to sleep like a civilian for one night if he remembered how. Then I told Louise 10 o'clock would find Kramer in our office. There was a silence, not empty, waited like dough before a rise. "I'll be there," she said. If I don't come, it means I decided to close this quietly." She hung up before her voice shook. Fritz, as if he had been waiting for a cue only he heard, sent in 2 small cups on a tray and a plate with a thin curl of chocolate shaved like a secret. Mousse. Santo Domingo 70%. It held a peak that would have survived a sermon. Wolfe didn't smile, but the corners of his mouth remembered how. He lifted a spoonful, tasted, and nodded once to Fritz, who accepted it from the doorway the way a man receives absolution. I did my part and took mine. It wasn't justice, it was what justice protects. Morning brought the city's regular racket and Kramer's irregular footsteps. They sound like a man who has been disappointed by most chairs and expects to be again. He came in with a cigar that had decided to wait for later and a hat that had seen weather. He didn't sit until Wolfe indicated the chair that won't insult his back. "You drag me up here on a cooking case," he grunted, "and I miss a raid on a numbers joint for this." "You may console yourself with a confession," Wolfe said. "You can pin it to your bulletin board." Kramer gave me a look that asked if this was a gag. I handed him the envelope. He read 3 lines, flipped a page, and read more. His mouth did the little thing it does when he'd like to growl, but paperwork is in the way. "Handwritten," he said. "Nice. You get me the pen, too." "If you insist," Wolfe said. "You will also find a recording of Mr. Greaves soliciting the method, a sample of the agent used, and a description of his nocturnal trespasses at Mrs. Vardel's office. He didn't offer the thumb drive. He never gives more than a man asks for." Kramer kept his eyes on the pages. "Health complaint? Filed from a number that traces to a firm employed by Miss Kincaid," Wolfe said. "I did not summon you to chase that rabbit. My client requires redress for sabotage. She will tell you whether she wishes a public file or merely your shadow at her door." Louise arrived then, on time and steady. She shook Kramer's hand without apology and took the chair I keep for people who don't need cushions. Kramer reintroduced himself because he's old-fashioned that way with clients who aren't crooks. He asked if she wanted this made official. She took a breath you could count to 4 on. Yes. Quiet would reward him. I'm done rewarding. That made Kramer happy the way a steak makes him happy when he's been promised salad. He tucked the envelope away, like a man pocketing a trout, and stood. "I'll have him before lunch," he said. "You want me to pick up the investor and the pretty boy for filing false reports and interfering with—" "No," Wolfe said, and Louise added, "Please no. If there's a reprimand to be delivered, I will deliver it. Losing me is punishment enough for Mara. As for Adrian, he'll either learn or he'll leave. I can't teach him with cuffs." Kramer grunted. "You people and your reputations." He looked at Wolfe. "You ever going to give me one of these without polishing it first?" "When you stop chewing cigars," Wolfe said. Kramer snorted, which is his version of affection, put on his hat, and left with the day's work heavier and his mood lighter. It's a talent of Wolfe's, to make policemen happy to have been used. Louise lingered. She didn't fidget. She has that going for her. "I suppose," she said to Wolfe, "I owe you both more than money. If you want dinner, a proper one, there's a seat you may have any night you name." Wolfe's eyelids lowered the way a man's do when he considers a sin that has never tempted him. "Your kitchen has enough to do," he said. "Send Fritz your purveyors and allow him to reciprocate with an evening here when the air has cleared. Until then, keep strangers' hands out of pastry." "I will," she said, "and I'll change that blind corner." "You'll change the habits that rely on it," Wolfe said. "The corner is an accomplice when character needs one." When she'd gone, the brown stone did its favorite trick. It became itself at once. Orchids upstairs, books aligning their spines as if they'd been consulted, the office settling. I was halfway to my desk when the phone rang again. Saul. He has a way of arriving with a bow on the last package. "Greaves is at his office," he said. "Kramer's boys are on the block." Kincaid is on the phone with a columnist framing a leadership transition. Adrian has posted a photo of a whisk and a caption about renewal. Dacre's bar tab from last night could fund a small orchestra. Any surprises? I asked. Just that the camera kid was packing his gear when I passed. He said, "No series, not this one." "Good," I said, and meant it. I told Wolfe, who bestowed a humph that could be translated various ways, and went to the window to let the day check in. The city was doing what cities do, arguing and buying coffee and pretending there's such a thing as ordinary. At 1, Kramer called from the precinct, voice like a shoe on gravel. "We've got him. He sang the same tune your paper sings. I'll give the DA the sheet music. You want to sit in?" "Not today," I said, glancing at Wolfe, who had closed his eyes in the universal sign for no thank you. "Tell him to save the solos for the arraignment. You and your music metaphors." He hung up before I could tell him we had a better band. Fritz fed us a late lunch, eggs in aspic for Wolfe, which would have frightened another man, and a steak, sandwich for me that wouldn't have. The phone stayed quiet for an hour, which counts as peace. Wolfe finally looked up from nothing and said, "There is a reason cooks are trusted with knives." "Because you can't cut a carrot with a spoon," I said. "Because the knife is the honest instrument," he said. "It does not hide. It declares itself and requires skill. The spoon, abused, becomes clandestine. A man who betrays with a spoon believes himself gentle." He made a face, not at me, at what men do. "Clumsiness masquerading as prudence is the vice of managers. It is worse than vanity, which merely wants applause." "That's going in a little book somewhere," I said. "I'll sell it to restaurants with the liquor license." "Sell it to schools," he said. And then, because even he knows when he's completed an aria, he reached for beer. By late afternoon, the edges of the day had rounded. Louise sent a short message. No adjectives, just facts. Police took Greaves without incident. Kitchen stunned, then relieved. Adrian requested meeting to renegotiate boundaries. Pia posted a schedule. The blind corner would have a mirror by Friday. The Mousse would return to the menu next week after a week of penance and a new plating that would not tremble. She added, as if she couldn't keep it out, the critic asked for a statement. I said we honor our guests, our staff, and our food, and we will not perform failure. Wolfe approved the sentence with a nod. "Good," he said. "Let the public learn to eat nouns again." I thought we were through, but the brownstone likes one last act. At 5, the doorbell rang. Fritz went, returned with a small white box and no messenger. No card either. He set it on the desk as if it were a letter from a country that had just declared peace. Wolfe looked at it as if it might explode. I undid the ribbon and found 4 cups of chocolate mousse, neat and perfect, covered in film that didn't cling. There was a line written inside the lid in a steady hand. "For the Republic." I didn't need to ask. There's more than one kind of apology. Wolfe took a spoon, tested a peak, and let the spoon rest. "At last," he said, almost to himself, "a citizen." I ate mine, thinking of blind corners and folded paper and the sound of a pen writing the word "placed." I also thought of what Wolfe had said about spoons and knives. You spend enough time around him and sentences like that take root. The office settled. Outside, the city did its yelling and selling. Inside, the brownstone returned to its natural posture, upright, fed, offended only by the usual things. There would be bills to send, and perhaps a reporter to dodge and a sous chef to compliment in a language she respected. There would be tomorrow. But for the moment, there was chocolate that didn't melt too soon, and a man in a yellow chair letting it be known that civilization had survived another fork in the road. The next day woke up like it had decided to behave. That doesn't mean it did, but the city at least started with its shirt tucked in. By 10, Kramer had his paperwork grinding and Greaves had a date with due process. At 11, Lon Cohen called from the Gazette to ask whether we were done playing food critic or whether there was a story the paper should not miss, and then pretend it had. I told him there was a story, and the paper would miss it if it came in looking for blood. He grunted in his civilized way and promised to call back when his editor had chosen a headline that didn't kneecap verbs. We have a system with Lon. He brings us ink when ink is better than silence, and we keep him from publishing anything that would make Wolfe take to his bed. Louise's message came mid-morning. Service would be limited that night. A smaller menu, staff meeting at 4, no cameras. Pia had a mirror on the blind corner already, and a habit change sheet tacked to the walk-in with more authority than most bylaws. Adrian had asked for 15 minutes with Wolfe, which is the kind of sentence that makes you hope the young have learned to say, please. He came at 2 in a suit that didn't wink and hair that had been told to behave. He stood before the desk, not sprawled in a chair, and said, Mr. Wolfe, I was a fool, which, if you know Adrian, is like watching a peacock fold itself into a pocket square. Wolfe regarded him as if he were a recipe that might be possible. You were vain, he said. Fools are incurable. Vanity occasionally yields to work. Adrian nodded. I want to stay. I want a camera later when I deserve it. I'll agree to boundaries. I'm writing them down. He produced a typed sheet that had not been touched by a publicist and handed it to me. It had clauses like no guests pass the pass without consent and no plating for lenses during service. It also had defer to Pia when I am dramatic, which I underlined for my private collection. Good, Wolfe said. You will also stop telling the internet where your employer buys her chocolate. I watched Adrian flinch. Then he nodded again, like a man learning he can bend without breaking. At 3, Polly called. It wasn't an apology. That would have cost more than she keeps in stock. It was a calculation read aloud. We're pivoting to a different chef, she said. Mara wants to cool the temperature. You win. I suggested the temperature had been raised by her matches and wished her a career in weather. She said she'd send me the footage if we ever needed to prove intent. I told her to keep it. Wolfe, when I relayed this, muttered something about parasites leaving when the host develops a fever and told me to tell Lon that the health complaint had been traced when he asked. He always asks. Vardell at 4 had the air of a house preparing for guests it had chosen, not an invasion. Staff stood in 2 arcs under the mezzanine. Sleeves rolled, faces still. Louise didn't speechify. She read from a page that said what needed saying. There had been sabotage. The saboteur had been removed. The police had been informed. The kitchen would correct habits that had made treachery possible. The restaurant would honor its work. When she was done, Pia stepped forward and pinned the schedule to a corkboard as if she were affixing a medal. Adrian nodded when Louise's eyes found his. He didn't smile. Good. I took my lap around the edges. The mirror erased the blind corner with a square of honesty. Dry storage had been reorganized by a mind that understands gravity, heavy on low, dangerous under lock. The ice machine corridor had a little sign that said, no fruit, and Leo had a Tupperware marked, staff snack, eat elsewhere. Small things, but kitchens are a republic of small things. The republic had remembered its laws. Back on 35th, the brownstone made room for Lon and his fedora. He came in smelling like old newsprint and satisfaction. We're running a piece that says sabotage at Vardell, manager in cuffs, no illnesses, chef chastened, investor chastised, he said. You want me to add that the health department complaint came from the investor's shop? Wolfe closed his eyes and opened them to half-mast. No, he said. The public requires a villain. It has one. It does not require a chorus. Your item about anonymous complaint will be understood by those who need to understand it. Lon grunted agreement. He knows where to stop coloring when the lines are already dark. He also wanted a quote. Wolfe doesn't give them, but Lon is a persistent gardener. Wolfe finally allowed, "Food is a trust. Those who break it for advantage should not be permitted near knives." Lon smiled as if he had just been handed dessert. He left promising to call me at 6 if his editor tried to soften the verb. He didn't call at 6, which meant the verb survived. Fritz's roasted chicken had been replaced by something that smelled like a forest, if a forest were delicious. He sent in a mushroom tart to steady us, which it did, and then disappeared to give the tart company. Wolfe drank beer and let the office return to room temperature. At 7, the phone did that thing it does when it wants to intrude and then regrets it. It was Kramer again, which means you answer or regret that. "He waived counsel," he said. "Says he wanted to send a message and didn't think it through. DA's happy. Says he'll take the plea if it's clean. Your investor has called 3 times to ask what she can do to help the conversation. I told her, read a book. Your chef's picture is in a column that uses the word redemption in a way that makes me want to throw something. Your client told a reporter she is grateful for patience and not much else. If you want to freeze the story here, you better tell me now before someone melts it again." "You're a poet," I said. "Freeze it." "I hate poets," he said, and clicked off like a man who had achieved something against his will. The last loose string came in on a knock you could teach in school. Saul Panzer doesn't make noise unless he needs you to know he's there. He stepped in, nodded to Wolfe and to me, and said, "Kincaid's pivot is real. She's pitching a food waste documentary to City Eats to avoid a fight she can't win. The camera kid has work in Queens. Dacre is writing a column-length letter to himself in a bar mirror. Greaves's lawyer will try for criminal mischief and a fine. The tub and the voicemail make that optimistic. I'd bet on probation with a reputation that doesn't survive it." "Thank you," Wolfe said, which is how he pays the only man he can't overpay. Saul tipped his hat to Louise's white box, still on the credenza, and vanished into the apartment's silence like he had never learned to disturb air. That should have been the end. It almost was. But the world is not tidy. It only pretends. At 8:30, another call. This time it was Leo, voice careful. "Mr. Goodwin, I just wanted to say, I washed everything. Twice, maybe 3 times. Even the things I didn't touch. Pia said I didn't have to, but I did. Is that dumb?" "No," I said. "That's how countries get built." He exhaled a sound that might have been a laugh, might have been a step toward believing the kitchen could belong to him someday. When I hung up, Wolfe's eyebrow asked the question. I told him. He said, "Good," and meant it. We took our coffee without company. The Mousse cups from the peace offering sat like citizens under a calm sky. Wolfe considers chocolate to be a punctuation mark rather than a speech, so I waited while he placed the period. When he set the spoon down, he regarded it like a gavel that had done its work. "You enjoyed telling Greaves that spoons are for the honest," I said. "I told him knives are," he said. "Spoons are for pretense when the hand that holds them is pusillanimous. A manager's sin is to mistake the appearance of control for control. He sought to engineer consequence without risking agency. That is a vice worse than ambition. Ambition, at least, will show its teeth." He looked at the ceiling as if the orchids were listening. "There is an ethic to appetite, Archie. You may feed it, restrain it, educate it. You may not counterfeit it without corrupting the table." "Tell that to the internet," I said. "I do," he said. "Each time I refuse to let a lens dictate a plate." He blew a breath through his nose that might, in a weaker man, have been a sigh. "We are an old house. We will remain one. If you think that was sentimental, you don't know Wolfe. It wasn't. It was policy. I filed it in the drawer where I keep the rules that make this job something other than muscle." The day dwindled. Lon's piece landed with the right weight. No exclamation points. A photograph of the outside of Vardell that didn't show any faces. A paragraph that praised staff discipline and didn't mention a single adjective Mara would recognize as hers. The comment section was mercifully brief. People argue about politics, not kitchen enzymes. Louise texted a thank you shaped like 2 words and a period. Pia added a thumbs-up emoji that looked uncharacteristic and therefore important. Adrian sent nothing, which was a good sign. Before bed, I checked the fridge in the office like a sentry. One of the original cups still stood at attention, the surface smooth. I took the spoon and nicked a corner. The mousse yielded the way good things do when you don't rush them. I let it be. In the morning, Fritz likes to pretend I don't raid his careful leftovers. It maintains balance. The brownstone settled into itself in the way I like best, quiet enough to hear paper think. Wolfe reached for his book with a hand that had already eaten justice and moved on to fiction. I took my usual position at my desk and wrote up the day while there was still steam in it. It had been a clean case, which is to say it had the usual smudges that wiped off under a rag with patience. Vanity, meddling, spite. The only one you could send to jail was the one who had tried to be prudent by being cowardly. The rest had to be addressed like weeds. You pull them until they learn you're serious. That's a metaphor. Don't get used to it. When I was done, I said, because someone had to, what do you make of "for the Republic"? A vulgar phrase repaired by intention, Wolfe said. She meant the kitchen. That is the only polity I care to vote in. He closed the book he hadn't read 2 pages of and looked at me. Lock up. I did. Windows, door, the street's noise on the other side where it belongs. Upstairs the orchids breathed whatever orchids breathe. The office kept our secrets, which aren't secrets so much as habits. If anyone had been listening at the window, which they weren't because no one is that devoted to us, they would have heard nothing more than a chair creak and a page turn and the soft clink of porcelain in a sink. That's what victory sounds like in this house. I turned out the light. The brownstone leaned back into its natural posture, a place where nothing melts unless Fritz tells it to. Intruders learn manners, and a large man in a yellow chair keeps the Republic from being overrun by people who think a dusting of powder is cleverer than a good recipe. I went upstairs thinking of spoons and knives, and how sometimes the important thing is not who holds them, but how you set the table so that nobody is tempted to pretend there's something else. That's as close to philosophy as you'll get out of me before midnight. Tomorrow there would be bills and the Gazette and, if the world insisted, another person who thinks a kitchen is a stage for their needs. We'd be ready. The air in the house was the right temperature again. Civilization, as Wolfe measures it, had kept its shape. A week is a long time for a kitchen and a short one for a precinct. By Friday, Vardell was back to full service with a menu that didn't apologize for itself, and Greaves had stood in front of a judge who measured him, found him small, and accepted a plea that will make him useful, repainting public buildings for a while. Mara issued a statement about institutional learnings that managed not to mention the institution or the learning. Polly posted photos of kale like it was penance, and Dacre produced a column that congratulated himself for preferring honesty on a plate, which was rich if you'd seen his hand on a shelf. Adrian kept his mouth shut on the internet for 6 days, which is a personal best and a social contribution. I went down to Vardell on the 7th day at 4 in the afternoon, when the room is all elbows and metal and nobody has time for poetry. The mirror had erased the blind corner so cleanly you'd think it had never been there to tempt character. Dry storage had a lock. The key lived on Louise's wrist. The "no fruit" sign by the ice machine had been framed. Leo said he'd made a second copy for his apartment, which is how you know a kid might go the distance. Pia nodded to me once and went back to commanding. Adrian's station looked like a chapel and, even better, like work. Bowls aligned, whisks where they belong. No camera anywhere except the one in his head that had been told to wait its turn. When I asked him how the Mousse was setting, he didn't tell me. He handed me a spoon with a dose on it and kept moving. That was better. I didn't linger. Kitchens don't like tourists before service, and I didn't want to pick up the habit of thinking I belonged anywhere south of the pass. I walked past the new little sign on the wall, a rectangle of white that read, in black letters without flourish, "Respect the station." A cynical man would call it dull. I liked it. Back on 35th, the brownstone was its usual self, quiet without being lonely, the books doing spine calisthenics, the orchids taking their temperamental breaths upstairs. Wolfe had a volume open that he was not reading. His eyes were doing more useful work, remembering a thought he'd filed away to enjoy later. Fritz brought me a sandwich I didn't deserve, and him a plate of something that looked like it required a treaty to compose. He ate with attention, said nothing while the course had the floor, and then allowed me to confirm the items in my mental checklist. "Kramer," I said. "Content," Wolfe said. He enjoys a confession that reads like a man has met his verbs. "Lawn," I said. "Educated his editor about causation and excised adjectives," Wolfe said. "An act of public health." "Louise?" "She will dine her guests with steadiness," he said. "She may also sleep." "Adrian?" Wolfe's mouth did a tiny shape I don't often get to see on it. It might be mistaken for tolerance. "He has arranged to leave his cheekbones in his locker when he begins mise en place," he said. "If he can sustain that for a month, he may keep both vocation and vanity." I let the quiet come back and then told him what Leo had said about washing everything twice. He inclined his head. He will either learn to trust his habit again, or he will become a man who polishes to cover fear. The former is craft, the latter is neurosis. You and I will not decide which. Fritz, who wasn't asked, nonetheless set down a white box on the credenza, the way a man sets down a letter from a relative who owes him nothing. "Messenger," he said. Inside was an old French whisk, the heavy kind, wood handle rubbed by hands that knew what they were doing, wire loops fat and close. A note went with it, a single line in Pia's tidy hand, "For the house that keeps stations honest." Wolfe looked at the tool as if it were a printed page in a language he respected and deceivers did not. He didn't smile. He took it in both hands and weighed it. "Good," he said. I called Saul to put a bow where bows go. He reported that Greaves' lawyer had stopped trying to sell misunderstood quality control as a defense after the DA let him hear the voicemail asking how to break gelatin. Mara had shifted to a food waste pitch about expiration dates, which even I don't mind, provided she doesn't try to stage them. Polly had pivoted cleanly enough that somewhere a yoga instructor got a commission. Dacre was spending more time south of 14th Street where people recognize him less. I wish him joy. Saul had no loose threads to report and none hiding, which is the same gift 2 different ways. I thanked him and put the phone down. The office exhaled. Wolfe said, "Into the air," which is where he tends to send policy. A kitchen is a republic because appetite is the only honest constituency. You cannot gerrymander it without paying. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. "I'll embroider it on an apron," I said. "Sell it to tourists." "Sell it to restaurateurs," he said. "The tourists will forget." If that reads like sermonizing, it wasn't. He never nags the world into virtue. He simply notes where it departs from sense and arranges penalties that make sense attractive again. That might be the whole job if you boiled it down. Remind people that their lives will be asked to carry plates too heavy for them, and when they drop them, charge for the dishes. The late afternoon wandered in like a cat with no appointments. I took a turn through the mail. Bills, circulars, a postcard from a Vermont cheesemaker who doesn't know our address shouldn't be given to people, and a typed envelope with no return that I handed to Wolfe because I'm not paid to defuse bombs. He opened it with his paper knife, which is honest, and read with his eyes only. "From Mrs. Vardell," he said. a list of purveyors and a promise. She will send us chocolate when she has spare, which she will not, and she will send us rum when she has the courage to admit it belongs with chocolate and not with critics. That got him a grunt out of me. I approve of rum when it minds its manners. We ate early because Fritz had a notion that involved timing, and I'm not the man to argue with his clock. The main event was pheasant that had never heard of dryness and potatoes that had studied under saints. He sent in a mousse for dessert out of respect to the weak, and if you think repeating a dish is repetitive, you don't know a good chorus. It's the line you wait for so you can hum along. Wolfe tasted and gave Fritz that once-per-service nod. It is not applause. It's a constitutional amendment ratified in one chamber, which is how the house runs. Between courses, the phone made small, polite demands. Lon called to say the Gazette piece had landed where it should. Read, nodded at, not shrieked over. Kramer didn't call, which means no surprises. Louise texted a photograph taken from outside her restaurant. 2 plates, 2 hands, no faces, the mirror in the corner catching the room in a small square of order. No caption. I showed Wolfe. He said, "Good," which functions in our office as both punctuation and blessing. When the coffee came, he did not reach for a book. He reached for the whisk. He turned it once and set it on the desk as if it were a badge, which in a house like this, it is. "Archie," he said, not looking at me. "Do you recall the dinner, March of '57, when a man refused a salad because the croutons were not symmetrical? I recall your speech about the difference between geometry and appetite," I said. "I also recall you eating the croutons before he could so as to spare the kitchen the insult." He allowed that to be true. "There is a breed," he said, "that mistakes performance for rectitude. They betray the table by demanding theatre from utensils. Greaves is of that breed. He believes in control without courage. The law will name his fault mischief. The kitchen will name it something else, cowardice. That's strong," I said, "for a man who chose an enzyme and not a gun." "Guns end lives," he said. "Enzymes end trust. The former is the policeman's domain, the latter offends me." He drained his cup the way a man seals a letter and stood, which in another house would be a cataclysm, and here is merely weather. The orchids upstairs had their evening, the city outside had its unending argument with itself, and we had the contentment of an office returned to equilibrium. The case had been clean as such things go. That doesn't mean it wasn't sticky. Human motive is jam, sweet until it glues the wrong things together. I locked up by habit and not by fear. The door has a sound you get to like, a solid little click that tells you wooden brass will do what people sometimes won't. On my way back to the office, I stopped to look at the whisk one more time and at the spoon Wolfe had used to test a peak. The room was the right temperature. The cups in the fridge were dignified. The air had nothing in it that didn't belong. If you want the epilogue, here it is. The city kept moving. Vardell opened each night with a mirror that told the truth and a pastry station that remembered to keep its tools to itself. The Gazette moved on to other verbs. Kramer went back to his numbers joint and raided it to slake the itch our neat package hadn't scratched. Mara found her lens on another face. Adrian learned that a peak can hold without applause. Greaves discovered that freedom has a different taste when you have to report where you spend your afternoons. Leo washed everything twice for a while, and then once when habit made the second wash redundant and not a penance. Pia continued to be the kind of woman who, if we built bridges as she builds schedules, would make rivers obsolete. As for Wolfe, he kept his republic, which is another way of saying he watched the door, ruled by seated edict, ate with attention, and arranged sentences that made men choose between theatre and truth. He didn't reform anybody. He never does. He made consequences efficient. That's the trick. Before midnight, he gave me his closing line without warning. He does that. You have to be listening so you can file it where it belongs. A man who sets out to melt a mousse, he said, eyes on nothing, is not wicked because he ruins dessert. He's wicked because he thinks dissolution is gentler than force. It isn't. It is only lazier. The world does not require more laziness. He looked at me then, which is how you know you've been given something to carry. I said, because the show needs a curtain, amen, and got my hat. The lights went out. The brownstone did what it always does when we've pointed a spoon at a lie and made it ashamed of itself. It held its shape. Wolfe didn't bother standing, which was no surprise to me. He was seated in the big chair, hands steepled, eyelids lowered like he was halfway to a nap. But that was the trick of it. He'd never looked less interested than when he was about to blow a man's life apart with 3 quiet sentences. Our guest of honor, looking less like a guest and more like a cornered fox, sat on the red leather chair across from Wolfe's desk. Perspiration had claimed the man's collar about 10 minutes ago, and I'd been timing his glances at the door like a ball player watching the dugout clock. Fritz, in his infinite mercy, had provided water. It sat untouched. Mr. Wolfe drawled the name like it was spoiled fruit. Your protestations have grown tedious. I'm not a policeman. I'm not required to handle you with patience. I need only demonstrate to my satisfaction the manner of the crime and the hand that wielded it. Archie. That was my cue. I produced the neat bundle of notes I'd been assembling for the past 2 weeks and laid them in front of Wolfe. He didn't touch them. He never needed to. He'd memorized more in one sitting than most men could in a month. You were clumsy, Wolfe said. His voice came soft, but it pushed across the room with the weight of a tank. Your scheme depended upon a false assumption that you were clever enough to disguise your movements as those of another. But you underestimated 2 things: Archie's tenacity and my distaste for incompetence parading as subtlety. The man tried a laugh. It broke halfway out, thin as old paper. That's ridiculous. You have no proof. Pfui. Wolfe's eyes opened, dark and sharp. The proof rests upon 4 pillars. 1. The financial ledger you thought destroyed. 2. The testimony of a witness who saw you leaving when you claimed to be elsewhere. 3. The inconsistency in your story about the missing key. And 4. The clincher, the smell. The fellow blinked like he'd just been slapped with a cold towel. He turned toward me, hunting for help, but I wasn't offering any. I was still remembering the way Wolfe had bent his nose toward that scrap of fabric, inhaled, and announced cinnamon where none belonged. You recall, Wolfe went on, that the victim was fond of spiced liqueur. That evening, a glass had been poured, left untouched. But the fabric we recovered, so conveniently hidden in the lining of your coat, bore not only the residue of the victim's blood, but also the unmistakable scent of ground cinnamon. It was the residue of your own indulgence, one you could not forgo even while committing murder. Sloppy. The man swallowed hard. His hand twitched once toward the glass of water, then retreated. That doesn't prove? It proves enough. Wolfe's voice didn't rise, but it cut like a scalpel. Combined with the timing, your motive, and the artless attempt to direct suspicion upon another, it paints a picture only a fool would deny. Inspector Kramer has had men waiting outside my door for 20 minutes. Archie, fetch them. I admit I enjoyed the moment. I strolled to the door, opened it, and waved in Kramer, who entered, looking like he'd been chewing gravel. Behind him were 2 uniforms, faces stony. Kramer barked the usual, "All right, you're under arrest," while the suspect stammered and went pale. One of the uniforms clapped the cuffs on, and that was that. They marched him out, his protests fading down the hall. When the door shut, silence returned, thick and satisfied. Wolfe leaned back, eyes closing, fingers steepling again. "Archie," he said, "see that the room is aired. Perspiration and fear leave a stench I cannot abide." I grinned. "Sure, and after that?" "Beer." His lips twitched, his version of a smile. Beer. That was the curtain. Another case cracked, another life ruined by Wolfe's ability to pull order from the mess. I fetched the beer, poured it into his glass, and raised mine in salute. The man didn't even open his eyes when he murmured, "Satisfactory," which, coming from Nero Wolfe, was the equivalent of a standing ovation, 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 of a standing ovation,